Hello and welcome to session 245 in the AISafety.com reading group. Tonight we will be talking about the article Democratizing Risk in Search of a Methodology to Study Existential Risk, and this is the second part. The authors are still Carla Creamer and Luke Kemp, and we are focusing on section 4, the meat of the article today, and probably next time we'll take the rest. It's called Flawed Definitions, Frameworks and Tools. How ambiguity and unverified assumptions undermine research into the apocalypse. So we'll start with the definitions and how they are ambiguous. I've brought up again BOSTROM's definition of existential risk, and I will point out that there are actually, this work made me look into this definition and see if there were problems with it, and I could find a number of problems actually. First, Earth originating intelligences, that includes a paperclip maximizer, in fact. So something that would destroy also a paperclip, like if humans die but another intelligence like a paperclip maximizer takes over, then that might not be an existential risk, even though obviously that's something we'd like to avoid. And in the same way, uploads, depending on how you want to interpret the word live, you could certainly argue that uploads are not alive, and that's also like an ambiguity in this definition, but I don't think this is something that matters very much. This was just me spinning my wheels. I don't think this is something that really matters to anyone in practice. So let's see what their critique of it is. The first critique is the one that we had quite a bit yesterday, that a core feature of this is that it's fixating on the future value, and it's obviously, it has this part bolded that is not actually focused on future value at all. The authors are making a stronger claim that existential catastrophe and extinction risk are very different concepts, and this is we've seen that the difference is on something that puts humanity permanently unable to realize their potential, but doesn't kill us all. That's the existential risk. And in practice, as far as I can see, most researchers seem to have this as the same thing, just in different matters of degree. So that an asteroid that kills like 99.9% of the population would be could be both an extinction risk and one would be an extinction risk, but it would be an existential risk that could potentially put us permanently behind. But it's kind of the same thing whether the asteroid kills 99.9 or it kills 100%. It's mostly the same hazard, and I believe usually people are working on both. I'm not saying that there are no people who work on one and not the others, but there's a very strong overlap, and he also suggests to split the fields entirely, and I think that would, for things like asteroids, it would make no sense to have a search for asteroids that would kill 99.9% and 100% and have those as separate fields. But I'm uncertain about this. In particular, I don't know if any researchers are actually working on, I suspect there probably are, but I just don't know, are working on things like how can we end up in a like a permanent dystopia, permanent 1984, some kind of sticky authoritarian system. The author Luke Kemp and Carla has another problem with this definition, and that is the lack of precision. That these things here, like how high does the probability have to be before it's a risk, and how represented probability that it will be permanent, and how many people does it need to kill. I think this is probably not a big problem for the definition, in the sense that most definitions are not precisely rigorous in this sense. Of course, outside of mathematics and physics and things like that. So I think having a definition like this, in particular of a field where we are so uncertain, makes perfect sense. There is a critique of the long reflection, the idea by Toby Ord that, or many others, that after we have reduced we should have a several step strategy where first we reduce the existential risk, and then we think for a long time what we will do before we implement it, possibly for millions of years. And that seems kind of value agnostic in that we're just thinking, but in fact there are some hidden things under this. For instance, agriculture. If we don't have agriculture, then we can't actually do this long reflection. We need writing, we need urbanism, probably. So there are indeed the values in the long reflection that we will continue having this. I think that's quite reasonable in that, as far as I can say, avoiding agriculture means genocide in practice, and giving up on writing seems like, yeah, sure, in theory it's a value, but very, very few people would argue that that would be good. They present some some argument that there is some circular reasoning around the long reflection. I think actually that is true, and I'll try to sharpen it up a bit here. In that, if we want to reduce existential risk, then one of the things that would be a risk would be that we decide that we will do something that will have our potential, cut our potential very much. And in going into the long reflection, we should probably not prevent ourselves from choosing that. In that, during the long reflection, we should have the opportunity to actually choose. Yes, the correct thing is that basically we all die in extremis, and the thing that makes the long reflection safe should not prevent us from choosing to die, if that's what we truly want. The argument here is somewhat based on this, what I consider is kind of like an edge case, if we should choose to die and whether that should. The authors argue that this is in fact more severe than that there are indeed many things we need to identify before the long reflection in order to figure out like what is a dystopia. I agree, it would be really nice to know what is a dystopia, what is a utopia, what are values. The problem is we probably can't. Unfortunately, we can't really solve this. It would be wonderful if we could. Hopefully there is some kind of attractive thing in that where we or when we are in the long reflection, we'll be able to choose a very, very wide variety of futures. But it is not, it won't be perfect, unfortunately. This basically, as I see it, like identifying what is morally valuable, that's like solving ethics. I don't think we're going to do that. We're going to have to make do with this, unfortunately. There is some argument about how the long reflection should be, and it's described as an age of perils. I just want to point out that the long reflection, by definition, is not an age of perils. It's kind of the opposite. And there's also some rhetorical question here, like if we if we steer humanity to a place of safety, we will have time to think. But who is we in that sentence? I think that we in this sentence refers to humanity, but I don't know. I haven't actually read the preface. Slowing down technology. Some scholars, it is suggested that some scholars should choose to stick with studying extinction risk rather than trying to specify all possible good futures. I don't really know if anyone is trying to specify all possible good futures. I think they might be quite confused about what people in existential risk studies actually do. And also, they might be they're claiming that slowing technological progress is a risk to a transhumanist. I don't think many transhumanists, in particular Bostrom and others who are aware of technological risk, sees this as possibly beneficial, and seeing slowing technology, that is a risk that we won't reach the transhumanist future. I don't know if transhumanists actually hold this view. My intuition is that a lot of them are really afraid of existential risks, particularly from technology, but I don't actually know if anyone holds this view. I would be interested to see. I'm not ruling it out that some people do hold this view. It is a view that's held in biorisk, that a lot of people in the existential risk community are very much against gain-of-function research. And somewhat in the contrary to AI, and people in AI are making arguments why it's not feasible to slow down AI, but the arguments are not described as convincing, so they haven't been able to convince Carla, or Luke. But to me, it seems like a really easy argument, and that's possibly because I subscribe to a more rational style of international politics, where countries, potential superpowers like China, are following their key strategic interests, and there is no easy way to just write a letter to China and ask them to please don't pursue AI when they have declared that this is a vital strategic interest. It just doesn't seem feasible at all. And they are making this claim that this suggests that what we're seeing is in fact a prescriptive thing rather than a descriptive. That when Bostrom is saying that he would prefer to slow down, then what is actually saying is what he actually means from this is that he would not like things to slow down, because the fact that he says he can't find a good way to slow down is merely some kind of smokescreen. And to me, I think the strong prior we should have on what these people actually believe is what they say. You need really strong arguments to suggest that people believe something other than what they say. They go into more details about what Bostrom actually believes. In one particular case, Bostrom has argued that it might be necessary to prevent existential risk to have an ambiguous surveillance system. And the authors argue that some people would find this a really good thing, and Bostrom, a number of not very strong arguments are made that Bostrom indeed might himself find an appealing thing. And the authors fail to mention that Bostrom in fact makes it really, really clear that he thinks that 1984 style surveillance is a really, really bad thing. And I think the arguments that they made, that this is published in a journal that relates to policy, is way less strong than we should believe when Bostrom say he does not want 1984, then we should basically believe that unless we have strong evidence to the contrary. There's also some more of Bostrom's view that are challenged, in that things that Bostrom says that many catastrophes are in fact not anything that have any relevance for existential risk. They are mere ripples on the surface of the great sea of life. And Carla is arguing that in fact these could be very interesting to study. And I think that's a contradiction in terms. If Bostrom says this is so small that it has no effect, and then trying to argue that actually we can learn a lot from it, then by definition is that too small to have any kind of influence. Perhaps. I'm not really sure about this. Moving on to arbitrary categorization, existential risk studies is claimed to lack a framework to categorize risks in a proper way. At least that's claimed. I haven't studied the field enough. I haven't read Toby Ort's book, The Precipice, so I can't really say whether this is in fact true, that there's something that is missing. I would like kind of some source for this if available, because but I realize, of course, that unless other people have noticed that this is missing, it's not entirely easy always to give a quote for this. And again, we're seeing that the claim that the fact that we don't have this causes us to prioritize existential risk to an extreme extent, and prioritize small catastrophes like COVID much less than the extreme prioritization of existential risks that we are currently having. I think that's we talked about this last time, the tendency of the authors to overstate their claims to an extreme extent. Really, we don't prioritize existential risk that much. One thing they do point out is that we don't know how very much about how these smaller catastrophes end up changing our trajectory. We do have some intuition, but it's really poor, and it would be nice to have more. One of the things that don't tell us very much about if a single catastrophe could permanently cause us to forego most of our value is the techno-utopia approach, the argument that most of our value is in the future. That is not going to give us the answer, and I don't think it's actually talking about this at all. The two things seem somewhat distinct. The claim that could a catastrophe stop most of our future from having value, and most of our value is in the future. It seems like they're talking about different things as far as I can tell. And it is suggested that instead we should to figure out if a single global catastrophe could stop our trajectory, we should instead look at wealth inequality historically. I think it's plausible, but I mean, someone needs to do the work, at least some preliminary work, to say that, well, this case where there was wealth inequality in the Roman Empire is kind of like what we're seeing with AI. It's certain that there could be some kind of interesting parallels, but it's at least not immediately obvious that there are. This was a part of the article that I am not 100% sure I understood, because it seems to. So the first is that if we are looking into the future at some ways we could become extinct, that does require some speculation. We can't totally empirically verify something that has never happened. This fact that it requires specialization is claimed by the authors to cause us to prioritize speculative risks above empirically supported risks. At least that's how I read it, and that's a non sequitur, really. We don't, I mean, it's not like we think it is more fun to study things where we don't know a lot compared to empirically supported fields. And this fact that the pathways to extinction requires speculation causes us to prioritize speculative fields above us, cause some people to conclude that global warming is not an existential risk. That's how I read the argument. It's still a non sequitur, and it's also created like the argument that global warming is not an existential risk is. The article makes it seem like it's obviously untrue. I think it's probably true, but there is no argument being made. It's just derided mostly. In another part here that I'm also uncertain whether I understood correctly, they present a really bad way of analyzing risks that they say is simplistic, ineffective, and wrong. And that is, you take a set of possible catastrophes, like you have nanotechnological grey goo and AI risk and meteors, and then for each of those you figure out like how many people are expected to die from asteroids. Well, it happens once in a million years and it kills X% of the population, and then you say, okay, so this in expectation kills 50 million people, and then you do that with all the catastrophes you're looking at, and then you see, is this more or less than the entire population? I think that's strange and stupid to do that, and I don't think anyone does it like that. Perhaps they mean something else, but this is what they have written. And so what they suggest instead is that we should look in a given world state, how much will a given event increase the overall likelihood of human extinction. And that seems like obviously better, in the sense that it's better to like have the world state and the event like given things and to try to figure this out. But I mean, we would always do this. I'm unsure whether the fact that it's not being done is that we just don't have the tools. We would love to do that, but as far as I can see, we don't have a way to do that. But if we had a way to do that, we would obviously do so. If that makes sense. Let's go to AI risk. There's a quote here: "A field looking for one hazard to kill them all will end up writing science fiction." And so I think in this case, it seems like they're really close to calling AI risk science fiction, but they're also not presenting any kind of arguments at all for this. And that makes it somewhat frustrating to engage with. Again, it's claimed that we prioritize speculative risks for the reason that we can't rule out the mechanisms by which they work. That would be stupid if we prioritize based on that we can't rule out something. In general, obviously, that's not how risk analysis is done. Just look at like what is the probability that this will happen, rather than whether you can rule it out. And they suggest a lower threshold of risks, and I think clearly they believe that AI risk is something that would fall under this. So this is like it's a difficult argument to engage with, really, because they believe two things. Both AI risk is probably a lot lower than people in the existential risk community believe, and also we should look at AI risk because it is below this kind of threshold that they're setting. And they also talk about that we have like direct ways of extinction and indirect risk factors, and that the distinction again depends on speculation. And so now we've used speculation in two ways here, in that the risk itself, the method, is speculative, and the distinction is also speculative. So I'm unsure whether they believe that it's like the same thing. I'm somewhat confused about this. And they suggest that the fact that there is a strong expert disagreement regarding risks from AI, that implies that the pathway from AI to extinction is less direct. I agree that there is, of course, disagreement. That's quite obvious. But I don't think the fact that there is disagreement means that the mechanism needs to be less direct. I don't think you can infer that. Simple and complex risk models. The simple risk models are those that are focused on hazards like asteroids and COVID and what have you. And a complex risk assessment have hazards as one part, but there's also vulnerabilities, hazard exposures, and response risks. And adding in these four factors is harder, but you get better results if you look at more factors. I agree. It would be nice to have better risk assessments, to have more work on like what is the vulnerability that makes AI particularly dangerous. But I do in fact believe that the people who are mostly focusing on the hazards rather than looking at these other factors are doing it mostly because like that's all they have to work with, really. That it is just when the problem is that doing something harder might just be too hard and people are doing their best. And why we do simple risk assessment mostly rather than complex risk assessment, it hasn't been explained or defended. I think it's quite easy to explain, in the sense that if you are really uncertain, then you do the simple risk analysis, and once you are more certain about things, then you can do more complex risk assessment. That would be my expectation. They have a really cool example here of an example where complex risk models give a different result from simple risk models. And that's in the case where we have global warming, and then someone tries to mitigate that thing, putting something into the stratosphere to block the sun's rays, but the CO2 is still there. And then we have some kind of nuclear war, and one of the things that nuclear war causes is that we can't keep up the stratospheric aerosol injection, and so these particles fall to the earth, and then we still have all this CO2 in the world, and that means that we get global warming that is much more rapid than before, and that could be a far stronger existential risk. I think that's a cool argument. I haven't seen that before, and I'm impressed with this. And that in me, I would have liked to see similar things for AI. I could totally see that being possible, and I wish more people would work on this, because that seems valuable, but also, again, hard, right? In that I feel that global warming is much better understood than AI risk, and to say nothing of nuclear war. Technological determinism. Like technological determinism is the fundamental idea that we, no matter what we try to choose, will mostly end up researching the same technologies for military economic reasons. And people in existential risk studies generally say that we can't really stop technological progress. It's either deeply difficult, undesirable, or totally impossible. This has not been fully defended. They say fully defended against. I expect that's to the satisfaction of the authors, and they are saying that it's possible this view is genuine, and it seems unfortunately that there is a strong lack of basic trust between the authors and the existential risk community. In that, in general, there should be the assumption that people are genuine when they state that they believe certain things. And in this case, whether it is in fact possible to stop technology is the people who say that it is, and that this is a tractable problem, they have to like come up with some kind of way that it can be done, right? Because otherwise it seems I think the onus is on them, definitely. And there's a statement that it's ironic that transhumanists are afraid of technology, and yeah, it is kind of ironic. And it's further claimed that this thesis that we are predestined to choose to research certain technological paths for military and strategic and economic considerations is claimed to be largely derided and dismissed by scholars of science and technology studies. That was a surprising claim, so I followed the reference to that, and it's unfortunately behind a paywall, but that's an abstract, and the abstract strongly argued in favor of technological determinism. So I'm not entirely sure. I would need to actually get access to the text to be 100% sure. But they give some more examples of where we have gone away from that. For instance, in weather warfare, giving the example that glass and steam engines have strategic implications, but were not really used strategically at first. I'm not entirely sure these are very strong arguments, but I think they can in fact be made stronger. And I think for the rationalist community in general, I think this is one of our blind spots. So I would have preferred to see a stronger exploration of this, perhaps a somewhat less adversarial exploration of this. We continue to Pascal's mocking, or Pascal's wager. This is the original formulation of Pascal's mocking, of Pascal's wager, sorry. And that is, if you wager for God, then and God exists, then you gain all infinitely much. And of course, if it turns out that God exists, then you are basically at the status quo. And if you wager against God, which is probably not doing the things that you think he would want you to, and he exists, then he will punish you. And otherwise, it's just the status quo. This in order to relate this to AI risk, we need to make some changes to this. We need to look into like what are the probabilities here. Are they like infinitely small? And this is using also infinity in Pascal's formulation. And also here on the right, it's not exactly status quo, right? So I looked a bit into this, looked up in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy whether this was actually like a central part of Pascal's formulation, and it's not, as far as I can tell. That this is, it doesn't matter whether this is literally infinite or not. There is a description of what the probabilities need to obey to make for this argument to carry. And I think it can be quite easily transformed into this argument for AI risk, in that if we try to prevent AGI risk, and there is AGI risk, then that has a high expected value, and if we ignore it, it has a low expected value, and there's a small loss, a small gain if it turns out that we are wrong. And this argument could carry. It's not one that is generally being used by people in AI, and the authors accept mostly because there is a sense throughout the I have in different that with AI risk that we are actually using this argument even though we are claiming we are not. But I do have in fact another perhaps more interesting point on this, and that is that this is presented as a part of Pascal's mugging, and this is in fact not Pascal's mugging over here. This is Pascal's wager, and I can see why the authors are making this mistake, because what they are citing is a very simplified version of the original Pascal's mugging experiment, and that version, as far as I can tell, seems so simplified that it's missing the central point. It's in fact the simplified version is by Nick Bostrom, so I think that's somewhat quite bad in that sense. But one of the ways we can see that he's talking about that we're talking about Pascal's wager rather than Pascal's mugging is that like the decision theoretic parts are not really explored, and like for things like Knud's up arrow notation, which is a key part of Eliezer Yudkowsky's version of Pascal's mugging, is missing in the simplified version. So there is a this simplified version of Pascal's mugging is just about Pascal's wager, really. I can understand why they are making this. Like the simplified version does contain the simplified version of Pascal's mugging does contain a reference to the real description of Pascal's mugging, and it would have been nice if the authors had followed that link, but I can't really fault them too much for that. Finally, we get to some problems with the expected value, and here Bostrom argues the expected value of reducing existential risk by a mere 1/1000th of 1/1000th of 1 percentage point is worth 100 billion times as much as 1 billion human lives. And that is shown as an example of how using Pascal's wager directly can lead to some very strange conclusions. And what they don't quote in this article is how Bostrom chooses to continue this. So there's a very selective way of quoting here. And Bostrom follows this by saying, we should stress, however, that there are important unresolved issues in aggregative consequentialism. So when this is presented as something that Bostrom is arguing, I think that is, in fact, plainly false. And I think this, I've previously referred to this as the worst argument in the world. The idea that you take something that a philosopher has written and then look at his own caveats and then you remove those and present them as if you found them yourself. And I think it's a style of argumentation that's easy to make. It appears really convincing. It is wrong. And I think, you know, cutting the quote like this has to be intentional dishonest. And also one more thing is that the citation is wrong, right? This quote here is from this text and not from that text, but that's kind of one of my smaller quibbles. That is all for today. Thank you and see you next week.